Welcome to Late Night History. Somewhere in the far north of Russia, inside the Arctic Circle, on a windswept stretch of the Kola Peninsula where the snow lies over the ground for much of the year, there is a hole in the earth. You could walk right past it. You almost certainly would. It is covered now by a small, heavy plate of rusted metal, bolted and welded down onto a square of cracked concrete, and if no one told you what it was, you would think it nothing at all. A drain cover, a forgotten hatch on some abandoned industrial site. A piece of scrap left behind when the people went away and the buildings began their slow collapse into the cold. And yet, beneath that small rusted lid is the deepest wound that human beings have ever cut into the body of the planet. I want you to hold that picture in your mind tonight because it is stranger than almost anything we could invent. The deepest hole on Earth, the furthest down we have ever reached, straight into the ground beneath our feet, is, at its mouth, barely 9 inches across, 23 centimetres, narrower than a dinner plate. You could not climb into it. You could not lower yourself down it. You could not even fit your shoulders past its rim. If you set an ordinary dinner plate down on the snow over that capped hole, the plate would more than cover it, with room to spare around the edges. That is the opening, that is the doorway. A circle you could close with the palm of your hand, and below it, falling away into the dark, more than 12 kilometers of borehole reaching down toward the center of the world. It is one of those facts that does not quite settle properly in the mind on the first hearing. We imagine the deepest hole ever drilled, and our imagination gives us something vast, a great black shaft, a pit you could drop a building into, a throat of stone wide enough to swallow a train. But that is not what it is. It is thin, it is delicate. It is a needle pushed into the skin of the planet, so fine that from above you would barely notice it, and so deep that the bottom of it lies in a place no human eye will ever see and no human body could ever survive. The deepest hole on Earth is narrower than a dinner plate. Let that sit with you for a moment. Let it be the first strange thing we carry down with us into the night, because there are stranger things still waiting further down. There is rock, kilometers beneath the surface, that grew so hot it stopped behaving like rock at all. It began to soften, it began to flow slowly, the way warm wax flows, the way honey moves when you tip the jar. And as it flowed, it tried to close the very hole the drillers had cut, creeping back into the empty space behind the drill, healing the wound the machines had made. We will come to that. We will come to the heat that finally won. But for now, simply know that down there, in the deep, the solid ground we trust beneath us turns out to be not so solid after all, and that somewhere far below the snow it is moving, slowly, in the dark, the way it has moved for longer than there have been eyes to watch it. Nobody truly knows everything that lies down there. That is the honest truth of it. We sent a thin steel finger into the ground and we felt around in the blackness, and we brought a little of it back up, broken and altered by the journey, and from those fragments we tried to read the deep history of the Earth. But we got in the end barely anywhere at all. That is the part that humbles me most, and I think it may be the part that will follow you down towards sleep tonight. Because the numbers sound enormous, the hole reached a depth of 12,262 meters, more than 12 kilometers, more than 7.5 miles, straight down. If you could stand at the bottom and look up, the surface would be impossibly, dizzyingly far above you, the open sky a memory so distant it might as well be a story someone once told you. And yet, for all of that, for all 12 kilometers of it, the drill got only about a third of the way through the crust at that spot, only a third. The crust of the Earth beneath the Kola Peninsula, the ancient stone they call the Baltic Shield, some of the oldest rock anywhere on the surface of the planet, is around 35 kilometers thick there. 35 kilometers of rock between the surface and the mantle below, and the deepest hole humans have ever drilled, the record that stood for decades, the triumph that took more than 20 years of labor in the Arctic cold, made it not even halfway. It made it a third. Imagine an apple. Imagine the skin of that apple, that thin red layer over the white flesh beneath. The crust of the Earth, compared to the whole planet, is thinner than that skin. And we, with all our machines and all our ambition and all our years, managed to scratch only a third of the way through the skin. We never reached the flesh. We never came close. The mantle, the great churning layer beneath the crust that the project had quietly dreamed of one day touching, remained as far away as the moon. That is the scale of it. That is the humility hidden inside the triumph. We drilled the deepest hole ever made, and we barely broke the surface. So before we go down, I want to ask you something, the way I always do. I'd like to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. There is something I find quietly comforting about it, knowing that this slow story is being carried into the dark in so many different places at once, in different cities, different countries, different kinds of weather outside the window, while we all sink down toward the same sleep. If you feel moved to, leave a word in the comments and tell me where you are. And if you are new here, if you have just found this quiet corner of the night, you are very welcome. You might press subscribe gently so that the next slow story finds its way to you when you need it. There is no hurry. There is never any hurry here, because tonight we are going down, slowly, layer by layer, kilometer by kilometer, the way the drill itself went down over years and years into the dark stone of the far north. And I promise you this, you do not need to stay awake to the bottom. You do not need to follow every turn. The point of this is not to arrive. The point is the descent itself, the slow falling, the unhurried sinking through the deep history of the Earth, and you are allowed to let go of it at any moment and drift off into the warm dark. The story will keep going down without you. That is what it's for. Let the words become the rocking of something carrying you somewhere old and quiet, and if your eyes close before we reach the heat that won, before we reach the fossils, before we reach the rusted cap and the strange lie the world told about all of it, that is exactly as it should be. Sleep is the destination, the hole is only the road. So let us begin where it began, the far northwest of Russia. The Kola Peninsula, a great hooked piece of land reaching up into the Arctic, where the Barents Sea is grey and cold and the winters are long and dark and the summers strange and bright. Near a small town called Zapolyarny, a mining town, a hard place built for hard work in a hard climate. This is the edge of the inhabited world. You are inside the Arctic Circle here. You are only about 10 kilometers from the border with Norway, close enough that on a clear day the two countries breathe the same cold air. It is not a place anyone goes by accident. It is a place you must intend to reach, and once you reach it, the silence and the cold and the endless pale sky press in around you, and you understand that you have come to a kind of edge. And it was here, on the 24th of May in the year 1970, that the drilling began. Now you must understand what the world was like in 1970, because the hole did not begin as a question about rock. It began, in part, as a question about pride. This was the height of the Cold War, that long, tense standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States, the two great powers of the age, each one straining to outdo the other, not only in weapons, not only in armies, but in achievement itself. They raced into space. They raced under the sea. They raced to be first, to go furthest, to plant their flag wherever no one had planted one before, because in those years a great scientific triumph was not only science, It was a message. It was a way of saying to the whole watching world, look what we can do, look what our way of living can build. And so when the Soviets decided to drill, they did not decide to drill an ordinary hole. They decided to drill the deepest hole anyone had ever drilled. They would not go out into space the way the rocket programs had gone. They would go down into the Earth itself, into a place no one had ever been, a place we knew in some ways less about than we knew about the surface of distant planets, because we could at least see those worlds through a telescope, and the inside of our own world was utterly hidden from us, locked away beneath kilometers of solid stone. The timing was no accident either. The start of the drilling, that day in May of 1970, was meant to honor an anniversary. It fell near the centenary, the 100-year mark, of the birth of Vladimir Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state. To begin so vast and ambitious a project in the year of that anniversary was a way of dedicating the whole enormous effort to the idea of the nation itself, a gift of science laid at the feet of history. There is something almost poetic in it when you think about it slowly. They marked the birth of a man, a moment 100 years gone, by beginning to drill toward the birth of the world, toward rock that had been forming for billions of years before any human being drew breath. 100 years set against 2 billion. The smallness of us, the vastness of the ground beneath us. But the deeper reason, the truer reason, the one that outlasted the politics and the pride, was simply this. They wanted to know what the crust of the earth was actually made of, all the way down. Not what the models said, not what the instruments at the surface guessed. They wanted to put their drill into the rock and bring the rock itself back up into the light and hold it in their hands and look at it. They wanted to find the boundaries between the layers, the places where one kind of rock gave way to another, and see whether those boundaries were really where the science said they should be. They wanted to measure the heat as it rose with depth, to feel with their own instruments how the earth grows warmer the further down you go. They wanted, in short, to read the deep book of the planet, page by page, in the only honest way there is, which is to go there and look. And so they assembled the people and the machines to do it. The whole enterprise was placed under the care of a body with one of those long, heavy, magnificently bureaucratic Soviet names, the kind that seems designed to be carved into stone. The Interdepartmental Scientific Council for the Study of the Earth's Interior and Superdeep Drilling. Say that slowly to yourself in the dark, and you can almost feel the weight of the institution behind it, the committees and the engineers and the geologists, the whole apparatus of a great state bent toward a single point in the frozen north. The council would oversee the work. The drillers and the scientists would carry it out, year after year, through the long Arctic winters, in a place where the cold itself was an enemy and the nearest comfort was far away. They were not, it must be said, entirely alone in the dream. On the other side of the world, on the other side of that great Cold War divide, the Americans had wanted something similar. Their project had a name too, a leaner, stranger name, Project Mohorovičić. The word is a kind of riddle if you don't know it, but it unpacks beautifully once you do. There is a boundary deep within the earth, a real and important one, named after the scientist who discovered it, a man named Mohorovičić. His name is difficult, so geologists, in the way that people who love a thing eventually shorten its name out of familiarity, came to call that boundary simply the moho. The moho is the line where the crust ends and the mantle begins, the deep border between the thin skin we live on and the vast hot interior beneath. And so Project Mohorovičić was, quite simply, a hole aimed at the moho. A hole meant to drill all the way through the crust and touch the mantle below. The Americans had a clever idea about how to do it too. Rather than drilling on land through 35 kilometers of continental crust, the way the Soviets would later attempt, they planned to drill at sea through the floor of the ocean. Because the crust beneath the oceans is far thinner than the crust beneath the continents. Out there, under all that water, the rock layer between the seabed and the mantle is much shallower, and so, in theory, the moho is far easier to reach. Drill through the water, drill through the thin oceanic crust, and you might, just might, break through into the mantle itself and bring up a piece of the deep earth no one had ever held. It was a beautiful idea, and it did not survive. Project Mohorovičić ran through the early 1960s from around 1961, but it grew complicated and expensive in the way that great pioneering efforts so often do, and in 1966 it was cancelled, abandoned before it ever reached its goal. The Americans never touched the mantle. The dream of drilling through the bottom of the sea to the inside of the world was set aside, and the moho remained untouched. So when the Soviets began their own drilling 4 years later in 1970, they were in a sense picking up a torch that had been dropped. They were taking the harder road, the continental road, through the thick old crust of the Baltic Shield, where the mantle lay not a few kilometers down but more than 30. They knew it would be slow. They knew it would be brutal. They knew that simply by choosing to drill on land in the Arctic, into some of the oldest and most stubborn rock on Earth, they were setting themselves a task that might take decades. And it did. It took decades. It took more than 20 years, longer than many of the people who began it would stay with the project, longer than the country that started it would even survive. But on that first day, in the spring of 1970, none of that was yet known. There was only the beginning. The site prepared in the cold near Zapolyarny. The tower of the drilling rig rising against the pale Arctic sky. The first turning of the bit, the first bite of steel into the surface of the Baltic Shield, that ancient Precambrian rock, formed billions of years ago, some of the oldest stone anywhere on the face of the planet, rock that had lain undisturbed through almost the entire history of life on Earth, and that was now for the first time going to be pierced and questioned and carried up into the light. I find I have to slow down here, at the very beginning, and simply sit with the image of it. The cold, the grey sky, the strange bright nights of the Arctic summer when the sun barely sets, and the long black depth of the Arctic winter when it barely rises. The little town of Zapolyarny nearby, the lights of it small against all that emptiness. And in the middle of it the rig and the drill beginning its long, patient journey downward, a journey measured not in days or weeks, but in years, the way the building of a great cathedral was once measured, with people beginning the work who would never live to see it finished. Because that is the thing about a hole like this. It does not go down quickly. It cannot. The deeper you go, the harder everything becomes in ways we will come to understand together as we descend. The rock fights you, the heat fights you, the sheer length of the machinery fights you. Every meter gained in the deep is paid for with effort that would be unimaginable at the surface. And so the drill crept down through the rock, the way water creeps through stone, slowly, patiently, kilometre by hard-won kilometre, while above it the seasons turned, and the snows came and melted and came again, and the years went by. And as it went down, it began to find things. That is what I want to carry you toward, slowly, over the long night ahead. Because they did not simply drill into the dark and find more dark. They found surprises. They found things that should not have been there, things the science of the day had not predicted, things that overturned what people were certain of. They expected to cross a boundary at a certain depth, a real and important line in the rock that every instrument at the surface had told them was there, and they drilled down to it, and they drilled through where it should have been, and it simply was not there. We will come to that, to the boundary that turned out to be a kind of ghost, an illusion made of heat and pressure and water, rather than a true wall of stone. They found water too, flowing in the rock kilometers down, in a place where no water should have been able to exist, water that no model allowed for. And we will come to where that water came from, because the answer is one of the strangest and most beautiful things in the whole story. They found gases saturating the stone. They found, far below, where anyone thought life could ever have left a trace, the fossils of tiny creatures that had died 2 billion years ago, brought up from the deep rock, still wearing the chemistry of their living bodies. And in the end, when they had gone deeper than anyone ever had, or by some measures ever has, straight down into the earth, they found the thing that finally stopped them. The heat that rose far faster than the models had promised. The heat that made the rock soft, the heat that made the very hole begin to close itself behind the drill, the planet quietly healing the wound as fast as the machines could cut it. But all of that is still far below us. All of that is still kilometers down in the dark, waiting. Tonight, we have only just begun. The drill has only just bitten into the surface. The year is 1970, the place is the frozen edge of the world near Zapolyani, and the whole long descent lies ahead of us, slow and patient and deep. So settle in, let your breathing slow to match the slowness of the work. Let the cold of the far north be only a story, something happening far away, while you stay warm and still wherever you are. We are going down into the Baltic Shield, into rock older than almost anything alive, through a hole narrower than a dinner plate, toward a record that would stand for decades and a secret the earth has guarded for the whole of its existence. We are going to follow the drill all the way down as far as it managed to go, and we are going to find out in the end exactly why they stopped. There is no rush. There is only the descent, and the descent has only just begun. Let us begin then at the mouth of it, because the mouth of it is the first surprise, and it is a quiet one. You might imagine that the deepest hole ever drilled into the earth would be a great gaping shaft, something you could lower yourself into, something wide enough to swallow a building or a road or a small frozen town. It is not. At the surface, the Kola Superdeep Borehole is about 23 centimetres across, 9 inches. You could cover it with a single dinner plate and have room to spare around the edges. The deepest wound humans have ever made in the body of the planet is narrower than the plate you ate from tonight, and the branches that go deeper still are narrower than that. Hold that picture for a moment, because it changes everything about how you imagine the descent. This is not a tunnel. No one ever walked down into it. No one ever stood at the bottom and looked up at a far-off coin of daylight. It is a needle, a thread of empty space, thinner than your wrist, dropped 7.5 miles down through solid stone. Everything that ever came up from those depths, the shattered cores, the strange water, the 2 billion-year-old fossils, the hydrogen that made the mud seem to boil, all of it had to travel up that single, narrow throat, kilometre after kilometre, from a place no eye has ever seen and no eye ever will. And that is the strange truth at the heart of this whole story. For all that the borehole reached down into the earth, nobody really knows what is down there, not in the way we know the surface. We know the moon's far side better than we know the rock beneath our own feet. The drill brought up samples, yes, but they came up broken, transformed by the journey, fracturing as they rose into a world they were never made for. Everything else is inference, measurement, the careful reading of vibrations and temperatures, and the chemistry of fluids forced up from the dark. Down there, beyond the reach of the longest needle we ever made, the earth keeps its own counsel, It always has. Let me give you the number because the number deserves to be said slowly. 12,262 meters, 40,230 feet, about 7.5 miles straight down. When that depth was reached in 1989, it became the deepest artificial point on the face of the Earth, and it would hold that record for decades. Other wells came later, in Qatar and off the coast of Sakhalin, and some of them stretched further in total length, but they ran sideways, angling out beneath the seabed for miles. Kola went down, straight down, to this day, in true vertical depth, in sheer distance toward the center of the world. Nothing humans have ever drilled has gone deeper. And yet, here is the humbling part, and the part that quietly puts all our striving in its place. For all of that, the drill made it only about 1/3 of the way through the crust. Just the crust, not the mantle, not the deep interior. The continental crust at that spot in the ancient rock of the Baltic Shield is roughly 35 kilometers thick. 12 kilometers is barely a scratch. We sent our finest machines and our best minds and 20 years of patient labor down into the planet, and we got about 1/3 of the way through its outermost skin. The mantle, the great hot, slow-flowing heart of the rock world, was never remotely in reach. It might as well have been on another planet. So that is the scale of it. A needle 9 inches wide at the top, threaded 1/3 of the way through the rind of the Earth, and stopped. Tonight, slowly, we are going to follow that needle all the way down. But before we descend, I would like to know where you are listening from tonight. Somewhere warm, I hope. Somewhere quiet. If you feel like it, leave a note in the comments and tell me what corner of the world you are resting in while we go down into the cold rock of the Russian Arctic together. And if these slow journeys into old and buried things help you find your way to sleep, you might think about staying a while. There are more of them here, waiting for whenever you want them. Now, let us go back to the beginning, to the year the first bit touched the ground. The year is 1970. It is the 24th of May. The place is the Kola Peninsula in the far northwest of what was then the Soviet Union, near a small town called Zapolyani, perhaps 10 kilometers from the Norwegian border, inside the Arctic Circle. A hard place. A place of long, dark winters and brief, pale summers, of snow and rock and the cold breathing in off the northern sea. And it is here, on this frozen edge of the world, that they begin to drill. The timing was not an accident. Nothing about a project like this was an accident. The first bit was set turning to honor the coming centenary of the birth of Vladimir Lenin, a date heavy with meaning in the Soviet world, a moment chosen to mark a great national undertaking. This was not merely science, it was prestige. It was the Cold War expressed not as a missile or a satellite, but as a whole. While the rest of the world raced to put men on the moon and machines into orbit, the Soviet Union turned its ambition in the opposite direction, down, inward, into the Earth itself. And they were not the only ones who had dreamed this dream. Across the ocean, the Americans had tried it first. Their attempt was called Project Mohorovičić, and it ran through the early 1960s, from 1961 to 1966. Their idea was clever in its own way. Rather than drill through the thick continental crust, they would drill out at sea through the thinner crust beneath the ocean floor and try to punch all the way down to the mantle by the shortest possible route. It was a bold plan. It was also, in the end, too expensive and too difficult, and it was cancelled in 1966 before it ever came close. The American hold to the center of things was abandoned, the funding withdrawn, the dream shelved. So when the Soviets began at Kola 4 years later, they were, in a quiet way, racing a ghost. The competitor had already left the field, but the ambition lived on, transplanted from the warm waters of the American project to the frozen rock of the Arctic. They would not take the shortcut through the thin oceanic crust. They would go the hard way, straight down through the thick old continental stone of the Baltic Shield, some of the most ancient rock on the surface of the Earth, and they would simply keep going, deeper than anyone had ever gone, for as long as the rock would let them. The work was run by a body with a name as heavy and deliberate as the task itself: the Interdepartmental Scientific Council for the Study of the Earth's Interior and Superdeep Drilling. Say it slowly, and you can feel the weight of the whole Soviet scientific apparatus behind it, the committees and the institutes, and the careful chains of authority, all bent toward this single, strange goal of pushing a needle as far into the planet as it would go. The purpose was, at its heart, pure curiosity made enormous. They wanted to know what the crust was made of, layer by layer. They wanted to find the boundaries between the rock types, the places where one kind of stone gave way to another. They wanted to read the temperature and the pressure and the chemistry of a world no one had ever touched. They wanted simply to understand the ground beneath our feet, all the way down, as far as they possibly could. And so, on that cold May day in 1970, the drill began to turn, slowly, patiently, biting down through the first meters of ancient surface rock, beginning the longest and deepest journey into the Earth that human beings would ever make. None of them, standing there in the Arctic cold, could have known what the rock had waiting for them far below. The missing layer, the impossible water, the ghosts of ancient life, and the heat. Always, in the end, the heat. But that is all still ahead. For now, there is only the surface, and the turning of the bit, and the slow, deliberate beginning of the descent. The drill string, when fully extended to its final depth, stretched nearly 12 kilometers from the surface to the cutting face far below. Imagine threading a wire the length of the city you live in through solid rock, in the dark, under heat and pressure that no human body could survive for an instant. Now imagine doing it one metal segment at a time, screwing each new section onto the last, feeding the whole assembly deeper and deeper into the earth over a period of years. The drill string at Kola was not a single pipe, but a column of joined sections, each added from the surface as the whole grew, until the whole assembly hung in the dark, like an impossibly thin thread dangling into the planet's interior. At the surface, it was perhaps 23 centimeters across. By the time it reached its deepest extent, it had passed through more than 12,000 meters of ancient Precambrian granite, and it had changed along the way everything the scientists believed they knew about what lay beneath their feet. The mechanics of how they drilled tell you something important about the nature of the problem they were trying to solve. The deeper you go, the more the Earth resists, not in any dramatic, cinematic way, not with earthquakes or fire or sudden catastrophe, but in the quiet, relentless way that physics resists everything. Pressure builds, temperature climbs. The rock itself, the same ancient granite that has sat there for billions of years, begins to behave in ways that models built at the surface cannot quite predict. And the equipment that works perfectly well in the upper few kilometers of a borehole begins at depth to encounter conditions that no engineer has ever had to design for before. This is why the Kola borehole did not go straight down as a single clean shaft. From the outside, from a diagram or a description, it sounds simple enough. A vertical hole drilled deeper and deeper until something stops it. But the reality was far messier and far more interesting. The borehole was, by the end, not a single pipe, but a tree, a branching structure of holes, each one a separate attempt to push a little deeper, each one numbered and named and catalogued in the records of the project. The main trunk went down to a certain point, and from that trunk branches extended, some deeper, some at slight angles, some abandoned part way and sealed off, the drill moving on to try again from a different direction. The branch designated SG3, which is the one that holds the record, reached its deepest point of 12,262 meters in the year 1989. But SG3 was not the whole story. It was the deepest surviving branch of a system that had grown over nearly 2 decades of work into something resembling the root structure of a very old tree feeling its way through solid stone. The reason for this branching was not a matter of design, it was a matter of failure. Deep drilling breaks things. Drill pipe twists under the immense torque of being turned for hours and days at a time. Metal fatigues, sections shear off. And when a piece of pipe breaks and falls to the bottom of a 12-kilometer borehole, you cannot simply reach in and retrieve it. You can try using fishing tools, long hooks and grapples lowered on cables, reaching down in the dark to try to grab a piece of fallen metal. But the odds are not good. Sometimes the lost pipe sits there at the bottom of the branch and simply cannot be moved, and when that happens, there is nothing to do but accept the loss, seal off that branch of the hole, and back up to the last point where the main column is still intact, still solid, still connected to the surface. Then you drill again, a few degrees offset from where you were before, angling around the wreckage that now sits permanently entombed in the rock, and you try to go deeper on a new trajectory. This is the reality that most descriptions of the Kola borehole leave out because it is unglamorous and complicated and does not fit neatly into the story of a straight, heroic descent into the earth. The truth is that the hole is a record of failures as much as it is a record of achievement. Every branch that ends before its time is a piece of equipment that could not be recovered, a setback that cost weeks or months of work, a choice to abandon and redirect rather than spend further resources on a problem that could not be solved. And yet the project continued, new branches were started, new records were set, the deepest point kept growing. And so the tree grew quietly and painfully, one failed branch and one new attempt at a time, over nearly 2 decades of drilling in the Arctic cold. The machine that did the cutting was not, in any simple sense, a drill that turned from the surface. This is one of the more counterintuitive technical facts about deep borehole drilling, and it matters because it explains both the ingenuity of the project and the nature of its limitations. When you drill a borehole of a few hundred meters, you can, in principle, rotate the entire drill string from the surface. You turn the top of the pipe, and the turning propagates down through the column to the bit at the bottom. But as the column grows to kilometers in length, this becomes impractical. A column of pipe 12 kilometers long has too much mass, too much flex, too much potential for twisting and breaking to be usefully rotated from the top. The torque required would tear the pipe apart long before it reached the bottom. The engineers at Kola solved this with a device called a turbo drill or turbine drill. The bit at the very bottom of the string was not turned by rotating the whole pipe. Instead, drilling mud, a dense, engineered fluid pumped down from the surface through the hollow center of the drill pipe, was forced through a turbine near the bit. The turbine spun from the pressure and flow of the mud, and the spinning turbine turned the cutting head. The rest of the 12-kilometer column above it stayed relatively still, not rotating, just hanging there under enormous tension in the dark, while the small turbine at the bottom did the work of cutting. The mud that powered the turbine then flowed back up the annular space between the drill pipe and the walls of the borehole, carrying with it the fine particles of rock that the bit had chewed away. The cuttings, rising slowly through the dark fluid back toward the surface, carrying with them chemical and physical signatures of the rock from below. This system was elegant in theory and extraordinarily difficult in practice. The turbine bit was, in effect, a tiny powered machine operating kilometers underground, in total darkness, in heat and pressure that grew worse with every additional meter of depth. It wore out. Cutting heads ground down against some of the hardest and most abrasive rock on the planet. Eventually, each bit had to be replaced, and replacing a bit meant pulling the entire drill string back out of the hole, unscrewing it section by section from the surface, stacking each segment carefully until the bottom of the column with its worn turbine assembly finally emerged into daylight. Then the process reversed. The new bit went on, section by section the pipe went back down until the column had been rebuilt and the bit was once again at the working face. This round trip, pulling all 12 kilometers of pipe, replacing the bit, running it all back down, took something on the order of 7 to 8 hours each way. A single bit change could consume most of a day or more. Not because anyone was working slowly, but because there is simply no faster way to move that much pipe through that much rock. And the bits wore frequently because at depth, granite does not yield easily to anything. Think of what that means for the pace of the work. Every advance, every additional meter chewed out of the rock face by that small turbine in the dark was eventually followed by a long withdrawal. The drill comes up, the bit comes off, the new one goes on, the drill goes back down, and then the advance continues millimeter by millimeter through rock that has been undisturbed since before the first complex life appeared on Earth. The pace, across the years of the project, was sometimes measured in centimetres per hour. Other times the rock was more cooperative and progress was faster. But the rhythm was always the same: the slow cutting, the withdrawal, the replacement, the slow cutting again. Year after year, the hole grew the way a stalactite grows, imperceptibly, patiently, one thin increment at a time. Now, why were they drilling there at all? What were they expecting to find? This is where the story stops being simply mechanical and starts being about something the scientists were wrong about in a very instructive way, and about how the Earth, presented with a human expectation, simply declined to satisfy it. For much of the 20th century, geologists understood the continental crust to be divided, broadly speaking, into two distinct layers. The upper crust, the part we live on and mine and study most easily, is predominantly granitic, rock rich in silica and aluminium, and the lighter minerals, pale and coarse-grained, the same kind of rock you might pick up on a hillside in Scandinavia or Scotland or the Canadian Shield. Below that, the models said, lay a denser layer of basalt, darker rock, heavier, richer in iron and magnesium, the same sort of material that erupts from ocean floor volcanoes and makes up most of the oceanic crust. And between these two layers, the models said, was a boundary, a seismic discontinuity, a place where the character of the rock changed abruptly and where sound waves, seismic waves fired into the ground and tracked by listening stations kilometers away, changed speed and angle in a way that clearly suggested a transition from one kind of material to another. This boundary had a name. It is called the Conrad discontinuity, after the geophysicist Norman Conrad, who described it. And for decades, it was accepted as a real feature of the continental crust, a genuine transition from granitic upper rock to basaltic lower rock, detectable from the surface through the behavior of seismic waves. The seismographs saw it. The models confirmed it. Everyone expected it to be there. The Kola project, among its many goals, intended to drill through that boundary. To push past the granitic upper crust, reach the Conrad discontinuity, and emerge on the other side into a world of dense, dark basalt that no human had ever seen. It was one of the clearest objectives of the mission. To verify at depth a boundary that had been inferred for decades from the surface, to actually bring up samples of the rock on both sides and confirm what the seismographs had been saying all along. They drilled toward the expected depth of the Conrad discontinuity. The seismic surveys had placed it at a certain point, somewhere in the range of depths they would eventually reach. And as the drill descended through the kilometers, The scientists waited for the change. The cores coming up were examined. The properties of the rock were logged and measured. The density, the mineralogy, the chemical signatures, everything was tracked, looking for the moment when the granite gave way to basalt. It did not. At the depth where the Conrad discontinuity was supposed to be, the depth at which the seismographs from the surface had seen the signature of a boundary, the rock remained granite, not dark, heavy basalt. The same material they had been drilling through for kilometers already, altered certainly. The heat and pressure at that depth had transformed the minerals, recrystallized them, changed their texture and their relationships to one another in ways that made them look different from the granite near the surface. The rock had been metamorphosed in the technical sense of the word. Its chemistry was essentially the same, but its physical structure had been reworked by millions of years of heat and pressure until it looked and behaved differently. But it was not basalt, it was still granite, metamorphosed, fractured, heavily altered granite. And this was a remarkable discovery because it meant that the Conrad discontinuity, as it had been understood, as a real physical boundary between two chemically distinct rock types, was not what the seismographs said it was. The boundary was real, the change in seismic velocity was real, but the explanation for it was wrong. What the seismographs had been detecting was not a change in the type of rock, it was a change in the condition of the rock, the same granite, altered by depth and heat to the point where it responded to seismic waves differently. The density shift was real, the velocity shift was real, but the material on both sides of the boundary was chemically the same thing, just under profoundly different conditions. This matters in a way that goes beyond the merely technical. The Conrad discontinuity had been inferred entirely from seismic data, from the behavior of waves sent through the Earth from the outside, listened to by instruments at the surface, analyzed by models. It was, in other words, an indirect inference, a reading of shadows cast by rock nobody had ever touched. And that inference, which had seemed solid and reliable and confirmed by decades of observation, turned out to be pointing at a real phenomenon while misidentifying its nature entirely. The boundary was there. The explanation for it was wrong. The rock that geologists had confidently said would be basalt was, in fact, granite under different conditions. For the scientists at Kola, this was not a failure. It was, arguably, the most important finding of the project's early years. It demonstrated something about the limits of seismic inference, about the gap between what waves passing through rock can tell you and what the rock itself actually is. The only way to know for certain what is down there is to go down there, and the only way to go down there is to drill. Indirect methods, however sophisticated, give you indirect answers. And sometimes those answers are wrong in ways you cannot detect from the surface. The Earth had, in this quiet and geological way, declined to be second-guessed. The rock that the drill encountered at depth was not simply denser or more metamorphosed than expected. It was also, in ways the scientists had not predicted, deeply fractured and saturated with water. This was the first glimpse of another discovery that would eventually shake the assumptions of the project. But at this stage, working through the upper and middle reaches of what would become a 12-kilometer descent, the fracturing was itself a clue. Fractured rock, under the conditions of the deep crust, behaves differently from solid rock. It is less rigid, it is more permeable, and its interaction with the seismic waves that pass through it is different in ways that partly explain the velocity changes the seismographs had been seeing from the surface. The granite at depth had been cracked over geological time by cycles of heat and pressure and by the slow movement of the crust over millions of years. Those cracks, fractures in the geological vocabulary, formed pathways through what might otherwise seem like an impenetrable mass of solid stone. And along those pathways, something was moving. Something that had no business being there at all according to the models. But that discovery, in the one that would genuinely astonish the scientists and force a rethinking of the deep crust, belongs to a later part of the descent. For now, the fracturing is simply there, noted in the logs, puzzling the researchers, waiting for its full significance to become clear. What is worth dwelling on for a moment is the texture of what the scientists were experiencing as the hole grew deeper. They could not go down into the borehole. No human being ever entered the working section of the Kola borehole. The diameter at the surface was 23 centimetres, barely wide enough to pass your arm into, let alone a person, and it narrowed further with depth. Everything that was learned about the deep rock was learned indirectly. From the cores that the drill brought up, from the instruments lowered on cables, from the composition and temperature of the drilling fluid as it returned to the surface, from the gases that escaped as the mud degassed at the wellhead. The scientists at Kola were, in the most literal sense, reading the Earth through the thin thread of the borehole, feeling the planet through the measurements and samples and chemical signatures that came up through that 23-centimetre opening in the Arctic ground. Each core that arrived at the surface was a small cylinder of rock, typically a few centimetres in diameter, perhaps a metre or more in length, that had been cut from the working face and carried upward through 12 kilometres of borehole and drilling fluid. By the time it arrived in the sunlight, it had been on a journey that most material on Earth will never make. It had come from a world of extreme pressure and heat into the thin, cold air of the Arctic, and the transition was brutal. Rock that had formed under conditions of enormous compressive pressure, held together for millions of years by the weight of kilometers of stone above it, suddenly found itself at surface conditions where that pressure was gone. The core would expand, fractures would open. Minerals under pressure sometimes release water or gases when the pressure is released. Some of the most interesting material with the fractured, water-saturated rock from depth arrived at the surface already partially disintegrated, the delicate structure of the deep rock unable to survive the journey up. The scientists would hold in their hands a rock that had just come from 7 or 8 kilometers underground, only to find that it had already begun to fall apart. This was frustrating, and it was also itself a piece of data. The fact that the rock fractured on the way up told them something about the pressures at depth, about the degree to which the stone at 12 kilometers was held together, not by its own cohesion, but by the enormous weight of everything above it. Remove that weight, even briefly, even partially, just by bringing a small core to the surface, and the rock's behavior changed. It was as if the material from depth had a different identity under its native conditions than it did in the open air. The deep rock was, in some sense, a creature of its environment, shaped by forces that no longer existed once the core was free. The drill teams worked in this uncertainty year after year. The records and logs grew, the depth increased, occasional setbacks, broken pipe, lost tools, the slow business of unsealing a lost branch and starting a new one punctuated the steady advance. The hole deepened. The temperatures at the working face climbed, and somewhere far below the level where the Conrad discontinuity had been expected, the rock continued to be granite, altered and fractured and full of surprises, but granite still. The basalt the models had promised was never going to come. What did come, from depths the seismographs could never have anticipated, was something far stranger. At around 6,700 meters, nearly 7 kilometers straight down into the Baltic Shield, at pressures that compress rock the way a vice compresses soft wood, the drill cores began to yield something that the scientists, for all their careful preparation, had not been prepared to find. Encased in the ancient stone, sealed inside the fractured and metamorphosed granite as thoroughly as insects pressed into amber, were the remains of living things. Not large creatures, not bones, not anything that could be seen easily with the unaided eye, but unmistakably biological, microscopic. The preserved shells, the carbon-rich residues, the organic compounds left behind by 24 distinct species of single-celled marine organisms, plankton in the broadest sense, the kind of life that has drifted in the upper layers of ancient seas for as long as seas have existed on this planet, microfossils down there at that depth, in rock that should have been utterly sterile, utterly dead, scoured clean of any biological trace by the heat and pressure of billions of years. They were approximately 2 billion years old. The number requires a moment to sit with. 2 billion years is not a span of time that maps easily onto any human experience of duration. The oldest written language is perhaps 5,000 years old. The oldest recognizable human civilizations perhaps 10,000. The dinosaurs vanished 66 million years ago, which already exceeds comprehension. But 2 billion years reaches back to a time before complex multicellular life existed anywhere on Earth at all. A time when the entire planet's surface was the domain of microbes, when the atmosphere held almost no free oxygen, when the seas were shallow and warm and teeming with simple organisms whose descendants would eventually, over the following 2 billion years, produce everything alive today. These fossils were not relics of some distant chapter of the story. They were from before the story, as most of us understand it, had properly begun. And they had survived. That was the part the scientists returned to. They had not merely left a chemical trace, they had not simply altered the rock around them in ways that could be inferred after the fact. They were structurally preserved, recognizable as organisms, retaining enough of their original carbon and nitrogen to be identified and counted and compared to known species. The granite had acted somehow not as a destroyer of biological material, but as a vault. The same crushing pressure that made the rock behave like plastic at the bottom of the borehole had also, at these somewhat shallower depths, sealed the microfossils in and protected them from the slow dissolution that would have consumed them in any less complete environment. Nobody had predicted this. The general scientific assumption before Kola was that biology and deep rock were two entirely separate realms, that once you moved more than a few hundred meters below the surface, you were in a sterile world, a mineral world, a world of physics and chemistry, but not of life or the traces of life. The recovery of 24 species of ancient plankton from nearly 7 kilometers down revised that assumption at a stroke. It suggested that the boundary between the biotic and the abiotic, between the zone where life leaves its mark and the zone where it does not, was far deeper and far more complicated than anyone had drawn it. This was the pattern that kept repeating itself as the hole deepened. The models would offer a prediction, the rock would produce a different answer, and the different answer was, without exception, more interesting than the thing it replaced. Consider the mechanics of getting to that depth at all. The borehole designated SG3 did not go straight down as a single, clean cylinder. Think of it instead as a tree. Not a tree that spreads upward and outward into light, but one that branches downward into darkness. From a main shaft, subsidiary branches were drilled when the need arose, each one diverging from a point where a previous branch had become, for one reason or another, impassable. Some branches were longer, some shorter. The one that reached 12,262 meters in 1989 was the deepest of them, the branch that had gone furthest before the Earth refused to give any more ground. The drilling technology was unusual, and it had to be. At those depths, the ordinary method of rotating the entire drill string from the surface, turning miles of pipe at the top and transmitting that rotation all the way down, was not viable. The string was too long, the forces involved too great, the mechanical losses too severe. Instead, the Soviet engineers used what is called a turbo drill, a turbine-driven bit at the very bottom of the string, powered not by rotation from above, but by the pressure of drilling mud pumped downward through the pipe. The mud entered the turbine at the bottom, turned the bit, and then circulated back up the outside of the string, carrying rock fragments with it to the surface. The drill string itself, all 12 kilometers of it in the end, remained largely still. The bit did the work alone, spinning on its turbine at the bottom of the hole, grinding through rock that had not been disturbed since the Precambrian. The mud served multiple purposes simultaneously. It drove the turbine, it cooled the bit, it carried the cuttings upward, it also maintained pressure in the hole, a critical function, because without that pressure the walls of the borehole would behave unpredictably, and the deeper you went, the more unpredictable that behavior became. And when the bit wore out, which it did regularly, because nothing cuts granite kilometer after kilometer without being consumed by the process, the entire string had to come up. Every section of pipe had to be unscrewed, each one lifted, each one set aside until the worn bit at the bottom was finally brought to the surface, replaced, and the whole process reversed. Each section lowered back into the hole, screwed in, the string rebuilt meter by meter until the bit once again rested against the face of the rock. From the final working depth, this operation took something in the neighborhood of 7 to 8 hours just to pull the string up, 8 more hours to send it back down, 16 hours, yet more than half a working day, consumed by a single bit change. And then the grinding resumed. It was not always the bit that caused the problem. The drill string, for all its engineering, was a 12-kilometer column of metal hanging in a narrow hole under its own enormous weight, subjected to heat and vibration and the constant slight movements of the surrounding rock. Sometimes sections of the string would twist under torsional stress and break apart. Sometimes a tool would simply be lost in the hole, dropped or released or twisted off at a connection point, and would fall to the bottom of the shaft and sit there, immovable, blocking any further progress down that particular branch. When that happened, the engineers would determine how deep the obstruction lay, seal it off, and begin a new branch from a point above the wreckage. The lost pipe and the broken tools remained there still, sealed in the dark at whatever depth they came to rest, as permanent a fixture of the deep rock now as the granite surrounding them. The branching structure of the hole was not a design choice, it was a record of every setback, every abandonment, every piece of equipment that had descended and not come back. The tree of holes was also a map of what the project had cost. Through all of this, the bit changes, the lost strings, the slow accumulation of branches going nowhere, the hole deepened, and the rock kept producing its revisions. The Conrad discontinuity had been the first and perhaps the most consequential of these. The seismic surveys conducted from the surface, decades before drilling began, had detected a boundary at a predictable depth, a layer where the transmission speed of seismic waves changed abruptly in a way that geologists had confidently interpreted as the point where lighter granitic rock gave way to denser basalt below. This was thought to be the fundamental structure of the continental crust, granite on top, basalt underneath, a clear compositional boundary at a predictable depth. The Conrad discontinuity was named for it, and it was considered a known feature of the Earth's architecture, mapped and understood. Drilling through it was one of the project's stated scientific objectives, not to discover whether it was there, but to study its character up close, now that they were certain of where it would be found. They drilled to that depth, they passed through it, and the basalt was not there. What was there instead was still granite, but granite that had been profoundly altered. The heat and pressure at those depths had changed the rock's internal structure without changing its fundamental composition. It had become metamorphic, the same raw material, but reorganized at a molecular level into something denser and more crystalline. And this metamorphic transformation had changed the way the rock transmitted seismic waves. had changed it precisely enough, and in precisely the right way, to look from the surface exactly like a boundary between granite and basalt. The seismographs had not been wrong about the existence of the boundary. They had been wrong about what the boundary was. The continental crust did not have a compositional seam at that depth, it had a thermal one. The rock above had been one thing, the rock below had been cooked, under pressure, into something subtly different. And the difference was invisible to every tool available, except a drill that could go there and bring back samples. The Conrad discontinuity, as understood before Kola, had to be substantially revised. The crust was, structurally, a more continuous thing than the models had allowed, but a more complex one, altered by heat in ways that seismic interpretation alone could not fully read. The granite below the old predicted boundary was also fractured, not broken in the way surface rock breaks, not crumbled, not shattered, but crossed by a dense network of fine cracks opened by the same heat and pressure that had metamorphosed the surrounding stone. And through those cracks, doing something that the prevailing models of deep earth geology had not predicted and could not straightforwardly explain, water was moving. Water was moving, not trickling, not seeping in some faint, reluctant way, as though it had found a crack and worked its way down from the surface over centuries. Moving, present in quantity, flowing in the geological sense of that word, through rock at depths where every model the engineers and geophysicists had built their project upon said there should be no water at all. To understand why this was so disorienting, it helps to think about what water does at depth. The assumption, the reasonable, logical, carefully considered assumption that had underpinned decades of geological modeling, was that at great depth, the immense pressure of the rock above would compress any pore space, any crack, any cavity to essentially nothing. The weight of kilometers of stone overhead was thought to be simply too great for open space to persist. And without open space, there could be no flowing water. The rock at depth should be, in this model, essentially impermeable, dense and self-sealing, its microscopic architecture crushed flat by its own burial. Surface water, everyone agreed, could not reach down through that kind of rock. And there was no plausible mechanism, in the prevailing understanding, to generate water so far below the surface through any other means. What the Kola borehole found, kilometre by kilometre as it descended through the fractured, metamorphosed granite of the Baltic Shield, was that the prevailing understanding was wrong, or not exactly wrong, incomplete. Incomplete in a way that turned out to matter enormously. The water was not surface water. It had not seeped down through the crust over time, carrying dissolved minerals from the soil and the rivers above. Its chemical signature was entirely different from that of surface water, different in its isotopic ratios, different in what it contained, different in ways that told the scientists who analyzed it that it had not seen the surface of the earth for a very long time, if it had ever seen it at all. The water was, in a sense, indigenous. It belonged to the rock. Here is where the explanation becomes something that requires a moment to settle into, because it is genuinely strange. The minerals that make up granite, the feldspars, the micas, the quartz, contain water bound into their crystalline structure. Not water sitting in a gap between crystals. Water that is part of the crystal itself, incorporated into its atomic lattice during the geological processes that formed the mineral in the first place. Under ordinary surface conditions, that water is locked in, the crystal holds it. But under the immense heat and pressure of the deep crust, something changes. The pressure bearing down on those crystals becomes intense enough, and the temperature becomes high enough that the crystal structure begins to reorganize, to metamorphose, as we have already seen. And in that reorganization, the bound water is expelled. squeezed out of the lattice like water from a sponge pressed out by physics into the surrounding rock. And then, this is the key, the rock above acts as a seal. The upper layers of the crust, less fractured, more compressed, more impermeable, trap the expelled water in the fractures below. It cannot rise, it cannot escape. It simply accumulates in the network of fine cracks that the deep metamorphic processes have opened, held there in the dark, kilometers below any surface, by a lid of denser rock that will not let it pass. The scientists who pulled samples from those depths and examined them found this water in the cores and in the fluid that came up along with the drill cores, and eventually in the systematic chemical analysis of what the borehole was returning to the surface. It was not a trace, it was not a curiosity, it was at certain depths abundant. The deep crust was wet. Not the dripping, pooling wet of an underground cave or an aquifer near the surface, but wet in the sense that the rock itself was saturated, its cracks filled with this ancient, mineral-rich water that had never seen sunlight, and until the drill reached it, had never had anywhere to go. The implications of this were significant in ways that extended beyond the Kola project itself. If the deep, continental crust contained free water at this scale, water expelled from minerals under heat and pressure, trapped beneath impermeable layers, then the chemical and physical behavior of that deep rock was substantially more complex than the dry rock models had assumed. Water changes how rock fractures. It changes how it deforms under stress. It changes its electrical conductivity, which in turn changes how it responds to the kinds of electromagnetic surveys geologists use to probe the subsurface. And, perhaps most importantly for the much larger question that everyone working in deep earth science was circling, water at depth affects the conditions under which rock can melt. The presence of water lowers the melting point of silicate rock, and that, in geological terms, is not a minor detail. But the water alone was not all that the rock was giving up. The drilling mud, the engineered fluid that was pumped down the borehole to cool the drill bit, to carry rock cuttings back to the surface, and to maintain the pressure that kept the borehole walls from collapsing, was coming back up, changed. The mud that descended into the hole was a controlled, precisely formulated substance, mixed to specific densities and chemical compositions that the engineers had calculated to do its job at the pressures and temperatures it would encounter. The mud that came back up from the deep sections of the borehole was different from what had gone down. It was saturated with gas, hydrogen principally, and helium. Hydrogen is not a gas you expect to find being released from rock in those quantities. It is the lightest element, and in the context of geology, its presence in significant amounts in deep rock fluids is unusual enough to demand explanation. The explanation, as best as the scientists could reconstruct it, involved the interaction of water with certain iron-rich minerals in the granite under extreme pressure and heat. A reaction that, under the right conditions, can produce hydrogen gas. The details of the mechanism were, and in some respects remain, a matter of active scientific interest. But the empirical fact was plain. As the mud returned to the surface, it was saturated with hydrogen to a degree that was, by all accounts, visually striking. The hydrogen was coming out of solution as the pressure dropped. The way carbonation fizzes out of a soft drink when you open the bottle and release the pressure that had been holding the gas dissolved in the liquid. Except that what was fizzing out of the drilling mud was not the gentle, pleasant effervescence of a carbonated drink. The hydrogen was coming out aggressively in quantities that made the returned mud appear to be boiling. Not boiling from heat, boiling from the violent release of dissolved gas as the deep pressure fluid reached the surface and suddenly found itself at atmospheric pressure, which could hold far less gas in solution. The surface crews described it that way. The mud was boiling. The gas was leaving so quickly and in such volume that the fluid surface churned and bubbled as though it were on a stove. This, too, was something the models had not predicted, or rather the models had not predicted it at this scale, in these quantities, at these depths. The Baltic Shield, that ancient and supposedly well-understood slab of Precambrian crust, was full of things that the models had not included. The geophysicists who had designed the project had built the best models they could from the information available to them, from seismic surveys, from the surface geology, from what other boreholes in shallower rock had found, from physical theory. Those models had been sophisticated and careful, and they had been wrong, not catastrophically wrong, not wrong in their basic framework, but wrong in their details, wrong in their gradients, wrong in ways that, kilometre by kilometre, forced a revision of what it meant to say you understood what was down there. The rock cores that came back up with all of this, the cores that carried, embedded in their substance, the evidence of the water and the gas and the metamorphic transformations, were themselves a study in what happens when you try to bring the deep earth to the surface. A rock core, in the simple description, is a cylinder of rock drilled out by a hollow drill bit and hauled to the surface for analysis. In the shallow world, where engineers drill through rock to plan foundations or study local geology, this is a reasonably routine procedure. The core comes up essentially intact. You can lay it out on a table, examine it, slice it, analyze it, and the rock you are looking at is very much the rock as it was in the ground. At Kola's depths, things were more complicated. The rock that existed 12 kilometers down existed under conditions that were, by surface standards, extreme. The temperature was far above anything the rock would experience at the surface. The pressure, the weight of 12 kilometers of crust above, was immense. The rock had come to an equilibrium in that environment. It was stable at depth, in the way that all things are stable when they are in the conditions to which they have adapted. The minerals in the rock were the minerals that were thermodynamically stable at those temperatures and pressures. The water in the cracks was held there by the pressure differential. The rock structure, the fine fractures, the metamorphic layering, the internal arrangement of crystals, reflected the conditions in which it had sat, undisturbed, for inconceivable lengths of time. And then the drill reached it and cut out a cylinder of it, and the core was pulled to the surface. As it rose, over the hours that it took to withdraw the drill string and retrieve the sample, those long, slow hours of lifting 12 kilometers of pipe section by section, unscrewing each joint in sequence, stacking them aside, advancing a meter at a time toward the surface. The core was moving through a gradient. The temperature was dropping as it ascended. The pressure was dropping as it ascended. The conditions that had defined that rock's stable existence for billions of years were changing continuously with every meter of rise. And the rock was responding. Minerals that were stable at depth became unstable at lower pressures and temperatures. The fine network of cracks in the rock, which had been held tightly shut by the surrounding pressure, began to open as that pressure released. The water in those cracks, which had been bound by the pressure equilibrium, began to expand. The gas dissolved in the water and in the rock's pores, like the hydrogen that had been boiling out of the drilling mud, came out of solution as the pressure fell. The rock, which had been held in a kind of enforced coherence by the conditions of the deep earth, found itself, as it rose, in an environment for which it was not adapted. It fractured. Not dramatically, not explosively, though in the very early phases of decompression, at the moment the core left its in situ pressure environment, there could be a kind of violent microfracturing that geologists would later learn to expect and account for. But steadily, continuously as it rose, the core was changing. By the time it reached the surface, some cores had fractured into dozens of pieces. Others had disintegrated to the point where they were little more than coarse rubble, a cylinder of fragments where there had been, 12 kilometers down, a continuous cylinder of solid rock. The chemical analysis of such cores was possible. The structural analysis, the attempt to understand the rock's in situ architecture, the way the fractures were arranged, the way the layers of minerals were organized, was severely complicated by the fact that the rock had reorganized itself during the journey. The scientists developed techniques to account for this. They learned to analyze the cores quickly and to perform certain measurements before the decompression processes had gone too far. They learned to interpret the fragmented cores, to read the patterns in the fragments and infer the structures that had existed before the journey upward. It was painstaking work, requiring a kind of interpretive patience that is not demanded of geologists working with near-surface rock. Every sample had to be understood in two contexts simultaneously: what it was down there and what the journey had done to it. Despite all of this, despite the fractured cores, the boiling mud, the anomalous water, the overturned predictions about the missing basalt layer, the project continued. The Soviet scientists and engineers at Zapolyani pressed on, and from those battered, fragmented, sometimes barely coherent cores, they extracted something that none of them had expected to find at that depth in that kind of rock under those conditions. They found life, or rather, the traces of it. At around 6,700 meters and nearly 7 kilometers below the surface, deeper than most of the world's mountains, a tall above sea level, in rocks so old and so changed by geological time that the surface world above it had itself been remade multiple times over. The cores contained microfossils, microscopic fossils, the preserved remains of organisms so small that they are invisible to the naked eye, identifiable only under magnification, their shapes and structures so subtle that it takes trained eyes and sophisticated instruments to recognize what they are. What they were was plankton, or more precisely, what they had once been was plankton, single-celled marine organisms, the kind that drift in the upper layers of ancient seas and form the base of oceanic food chains, the kind that, when they die, sink to the seafloor and are slowly buried in sediment. 24 distinct species, not a smear of ambiguous organic material that might have been biological or might have been something else. 24 species, distinct enough from one another that they could be separately identified, their characteristic forms preserved in the rock that had enclosed them. The fossils were not made of stone in the way that most people imagine fossils to be. The rock had not simply replaced the organic material of the organisms with minerals, the way that the great fossil record of larger creatures is typically preserved. Bone replaced by silica, shell replaced by calcite. These microfossils were different. They retained their original organic chemistry. They were carbon-rich and nitrogen-rich, encased in organic compounds, preserved in a way that kept something of their original biological substance rather than replacing it entirely with inorganic mineral. At 6.5 kilometers below the surface, under pressures and at temperatures that would seem to promise obliteration of anything so fragile as a biological remnant, the tiny ghosts of these ancient creatures had survived. They were old. This needs a moment to land properly because the timescales involved are difficult to hold in the mind. The rocks in which the fossils were found were Precambrian, rocks laid down in the deep, distant past that precedes the Cambrian explosion, that biological watershed roughly 540 million years ago when the fossil record of complex multicellular life suddenly becomes rich and diverse and unmistakable. Precambrian time stretches back from that point for billions of years. The microfossils recovered from the Kola cores were estimated to be approximately 2 billion years old. 2 billion years. The Earth itself is approximately 4.5 billion years old. 2 billion years ago, the planet was already ancient by any reasonable measure, already more than halfway through its existence as a solid body orbiting the Sun. The continents were arranged entirely differently than they are today. The atmosphere was in the process of being transformed by the slow and revolutionary work of photosynthetic life from one dominated by methane and carbon dioxide into one that contained significant oxygen. The Great Oxygenation Event, the biological coup that made the modern world's oxygen-rich atmosphere possible. In the shallow seas of that ancient world, life existed, microbial, single-celled, simple by the standards of the organisms that would eventually evolve from it, but life nonetheless, already 2 billion years into its own history by that point. And these organisms, these particular plankton, these 24 species of microscopic creatures that had drifted in some ancient ocean, had died and sunk and been buried in sediment, and that sediment had been compressed over geological time into rock, and that rock had been carried down by the slow, grinding movements of the Earth's crust down into the deep continental shield and buried under kilometers of subsequent rock, and subjected to the heat and pressure that had metamorphosed everything around it, and had survived for 2 billion years in the dark under crushing pressure, at temperatures that should by rights have destroyed everything biological they contained, and had emerged recognizable in the shattered cores that the Kola drill brought back to the surface. The scientists examining those cores were careful people, careful scientists trained to consider alternative explanations before accepting a surprising conclusion. The first question about any biological material found deep in a rock core is contamination. Could the organic material have come from somewhere else? Could it have been introduced during drilling, in the drilling fluid, on the equipment, from the surface environment? This is not a paranoid question. It is the correct and necessary question, and the answer, in this case, required detailed analysis of the chemistry and the structure of the fossils. The organic compounds encasing the microfossils were not consistent with surface contamination. Their chemical signatures matched the rock in which they were embedded, not the introduced drilling mud or any surface biological material. The fossils were genuinely ancient. They genuinely came from that depth. They were real. The implication was something that extended well beyond the Kola borehole itself. If 2 billion-year-old biological material could survive at depths of nearly 7 kilometers, preserved by the very conditions that seemed most hostile to it, if the extraordinary pressure and the relative chemical stability of that deep, sealed environment could actually protect organic matter over timescales that dwarf anything in human history, then the question of where life might persist, and for how long, and under what conditions, was open in ways it had not been before. The deep crust was not, as it had been comfortable to assume, a sterile and purely geological realm entirely divorced from biology. It was, or had been, penetrated by life. And traces of that penetration could survive, impossibly, in the rock. There was something else about those fossils that deserved particular attention, and that speaks to the strangeness of the place from which they came. They were found not in sedimentary rock, the kind of rock that forms from compressed sediment, in which fossils are routinely expected, but in the metamorphic granite of the Baltic Shield. Rock that had, as we have already discussed, been through immense heat and pressure. Rock that had been reorganized at a molecular level. Rock that was, in terms of the conventional fossil record, not the kind of place anyone would think to look. The fossils had survived the metamorphic processes. Or rather, and this is the more precise and more remarkable statement, the organic compounds encasing them had survived, had persisted through transformations in the surrounding mineral structure that should, by any simple account, have destroyed them. The world that those cores came from, kilometre by kilometre, was not the world the models had described. It was wetter, stranger, more biologically historical, and in ways that were only beginning to be understood, more complicated than anything the seismic surveys from the surface had been able to suggest. Each sample that came back up, each cylinder of fractured, decompressed, sometimes barely coherent rock, was a message from a place that no human being had ever been and would never go. The drill was a kind of correspondence. The Earth was writing back. The facility at Zapolyani, in the years when the drilling was active, was not a glamorous place. This is worth pausing on because there is a tendency, looking back at a project of this scale and ambition, to imagine it as an imposing thing, a monument to Soviet engineering, something severe and impressive on the Arctic landscape, designed to announce itself. It was not that. The Kola Peninsula in winter is a flat, wind-stripped terrain of low, scrubby vegetation and frozen ground, close to the Norwegian border, inside the Arctic Circle, where the sun disappears for weeks in midwinter and returns for weeks in midsummer in a long, slanted, undark version of night that takes getting used to. The town of Zapolyani nearby was a functional industrial settlement. The drilling facility itself was a collection of working buildings arranged around the derrick, unremarkable structures built to be useful, not to be seen. Inside, the work was relentless and precise. The teams that operated the turbo drill and managed the 12-kilometer pipe string worked in shifts because the borehole could not simply be stopped and left for any length of time without the risk of losing the hole. The rock was already, at depth, beginning to creep, and a pause was always a risk. The scientists who analyzed the cores and the fluids worked alongside the engineers who maintained the drilling equipment in a collaboration that was simultaneously scientific and deeply practical. The drilling mud was monitored constantly. The gases emerging from it were measured and analyzed. The cores, when they arrived, were processed quickly before the decompression effects progressed too far. The temperature of the returning mud was tracked. The rate of penetration of the drill, how fast it was moving through the rock at depth, was watched closely because a sudden change in penetration rate could signal a change in rock type or a fracture zone or the approach of conditions that would require a change in equipment or technique. It was, in its way, a kind of listening. The surface team was listening to the whole, and the whole, through every change in the mud's chemistry, every shift in the drill's rate of progress, every sample that came back up, was speaking. What it was saying as the drill pushed deeper through the middle years of the project was that the Earth kept its secrets thoroughly. Every answer that came back up from the depths carried within it a new question. The missing basalt had raised the question of what, exactly, the Conrad discontinuity was made of, if not a compositional boundary. And the answer, metamorphic transformation, raised the further question of exactly what conditions had produced that transformation, and what other seismic boundaries might similarly be thermal rather than compositional. The water had raised the question of whether the deep crust hosted chemical and even biological processes that had been assumed not to exist there. The fossils had raised the question of how far back the penetration of the deep rock by biological material extended and what that meant for the chemical evolution of the crust over geological time. The answers to those questions were not going to come from the surface. They were not going to come from seismic surveys or gravity measurements or electromagnetic probing. They were going to come, if they came at all, from more holes, deeper holes, from drilling that could push past 12 kilometers, past the depths the Kola borehole had reached, into rock that no human instrument had yet touched. The dream of the project, the dream that had animated it from the beginning, that had justified the funding and the years of work and the extraordinary engineering, was to reach 15,000 meters, 15 kilometers, to go further than Kola had gone, to push through the deep crust into conditions that were still, in 1989 when the drill reached its deepest point, entirely uncharted. The question that was already beginning to press itself as the drilling reached 12 kilometers and the drill string was at the limit of what it could do was whether 15,000 meters was possible. Not possible in principle. Possible with the equipment that existed, with the technology that could be built, with the materials that engineers could make. Whether the Earth would allow it, whether the conditions at that depth were ones that any drill, any fluid, any pipe could survive. The answer to that question was being written kilometer by kilometer in the temperature readings from the hole. And the temperature readings were telling a story that the project's planners had not wanted to hear, and that was becoming, as the drill pushed deeper, impossible to ignore. The geothermal gradient, the rate at which temperature rises as you descend into the Earth, had been estimated for the Baltic Shield before drilling began. The estimates had been based on the best available data, surface measurements of the heat flowing out of the rock, the known thermal properties of the granitic crust, the theoretical models of how heat is generated and conducted in the deep continental lithosphere. Those estimates had suggested that at the target depth of 15,000 meters, the temperature would be around 100 degrees Celsius. Hot. Hot enough to be challenging, but manageable. Within the range that drill equipment, carefully designed and maintained, could handle. The actual readings were different. The temperature in the borehole rose faster than the models had predicted, not dramatically faster at first. The early kilometers showed a gradient that was close enough to the predictions to seem acceptable, but as the drill pushed deeper and the temperature readings accumulated, it became clear that the gradient was steeper than the models had assumed. The Baltic Shield was transmitting heat from below more efficiently than the surface measurements had suggested it should. The reasons for this were connected to everything else the borehole was finding: the water in the cracks, the fracture zones, the metamorphic changes in the rock. All of these affected how heat moved through the crust, and none of them had been fully incorporated into the pre-drilling models. At 12 kilometers, at 12,262 meters, where the SG3 branch reached its deepest point in 1989, the temperature in the borehole was approximately 180 degrees Celsius. Not 100, not the value the models had promised. 180 degrees, nearly twice what had been predicted. And at 15,000 meters, the target depth, the depth the project had been built to reach, the projected temperature extrapolated from the gradient the borehole had actually measured was approximately 300 degrees Celsius. 300 degrees Celsius is the temperature of a very hot oven. It is the temperature at which certain metals begin to lose their structural properties. It is a temperature at which the lubricants and seals in drilling equipment stop functioning. It is a temperature at which the engineering constraints of drilling become, with the technology available in the late 1980s and early 1990s, not merely difficult, but insurmountable. But even before that limit was reached, even at the temperatures already encountered at 12 kilometers, the rock itself was doing something that no equipment modification could address. Something that had already been glimpsed in the behavior of the borehole walls during drilling, and that was now, at the deepest sections, becoming unmistakable. The rock was moving. At the temperatures and pressures found at 12 kilometers below the surface of the Kola Peninsula, granite does not behave the way granite behaves in a quarry, or on a countertop, or in the foundation of a building. At the surface, granite is among the hardest, most stubborn materials the natural world produces. It resists, it endures. Civilizations have built their monuments from it precisely because it does not yield. But deep in the earth, under kilometer after kilometer of overlying rock, pressing down with the cumulative weight of everything above, and with temperatures approaching and exceeding 180 degrees Celsius, granite begins to behave differently. The distinction geologists draw is between brittle rock and ductile rock, and the word ductile here carries a meaning worth pausing over. Ductile does not mean liquid. It does not mean the rock melts or flows like water or becomes magma. Ductile means something subtler and in its way more unsettling. It means the rock deforms slowly under sustained pressure without fracturing. It means that given enough time and enough heat, a material that would shatter at the surface will instead bend, creep, and yield. It behaves, for all practical engineering purposes, something like very cold, very stiff wax, or like glass, which is technically a slow liquid and will, over centuries, flow almost imperceptibly downward under its own weight. The rock at depth was doing something similar, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily and inexorably, and the consequence of this for a hole drilled through that rock was direct and devastating. The walls of the borehole, subjected to those temperatures and that pressure, did not stay where the drill had put them. They crept inward. Slowly but measurably, the rock on every side of the shaft pressed back toward the center, toward the void that the drill had opened. The hole began to close itself. Think of pressing a finger into a block of cold butter, then withdrawing the finger and watching the butter gradually ease back, the walls of the depression closing in on the space you made. The motion is not violent. It is quiet and patient. And the rock at depth had the same patience and far more time. The borehole, if left undrilled for a period, would tighten. The drill string, if left stationary, could be gripped. Sections of the hole that had been opened and then not actively maintained could narrow to the point where equipment could not pass through them. The earth, in other words, was healing itself. The wound the engineers had spent years opening was being closed, slowly and without drama, by the simple physical behavior of material pushed past its brittle threshold. This was not a surprise in the abstract. Geologists understood in principle that rock at depth under extreme conditions would behave differently than rock at the surface, but understanding a thing in principle and encountering it at the end of 12 kilometers of drill pipe in a hole that took years to make is a different experience entirely. The practical consequences were severe. Drilling fluid. The heavy mud pumped down the drill string to cool the bit, carry the cuttings back up to the surface, and maintain the pressure balance in the hole behaved differently at those temperatures than its formulations predicted. Lubricants degraded faster, seals failed. The drill bit itself, spinning at the bottom of a 12-kilometer column of pipe, was doing its work in conditions that the engineers on the surface could not directly observe and could only partially model. And when the drill string was pulled, a process that, as had already been established through hard experience, took 7 or 8 hours just to extract the pipe from the hole, section by section, before a single worn bit could be changed, the state of the deepest sections of the borehole could be assessed only indirectly, by the resistance of the equipment, by the behavior of the returning mud, by the logs and measurements that came back from instruments lowered into the shaft. What those measurements suggested in the final years of active deep drilling was that the deepest sections of the hole were not entirely cooperative. The rock was pressing in. The conditions were, in the plainest engineering language, deteriorating. There is a number that sits at the far end of this story, and it is worth dwelling on. The project had been designed with a target depth of 15,000 meters, not 12,862, 15,000. The difference between what was achieved and what was intended is nearly 3 kilometers. 3 kilometers of rock that the drill never reached, that the engineers planned to penetrate and could not. And the reason that 3 kilometers remained undrilled was not a failure of will, or a failure of imagination, or a shortage of years. The project continued for more than 2 decades. The reason was a temperature, based on the geothermal gradient that the borehole had actually measured. The real gradient, the steeper, hotter, less forgiving gradient that differed from the predicted one. The temperature at 15,000 meters would have been approximately 300 degrees Celsius. Not 180, 300. 300 degrees Celsius was the wall, not a political wall, not a strategic one, a physical one. The equipment available, the drill bits, the casings, the lubricants, the electronic instruments, the seals and the motors could not function at 300 degrees. Some of this equipment was already being pushed to its limits at the temperatures encountered at 12 kilometers. Another 3 kilometers of descent into rock, another 120 degrees hotter, would have meant drilling with equipment that would fail before it arrived. The drill would reach the target depth in pieces if it reached it at all. 300 degrees was not a challenge to be engineered around with a little more effort. It was, with the technology of that era, a ceiling. And so the drilling slowed. The progress that had once been measured in hundreds of meters per year dwindled to tens. The branches of the borehole, the tree of holes that the project had become, each new branch angling around the wreckage of a lost drill string or the narrowed, closed section of an older shaft, were probed to their limits and found to be at their limits. The years passed, and then something happened that had nothing to do with rock or heat or equipment at all. The Soviet Union, which had funded the project from its first planning meetings in the 1960s through more than 2 decades of active drilling, ceased to exist. The collapse of the USSR in 1991 did not immediately and visibly kill the Kola Superdeep Borehole project. These things rarely end in a single dramatic moment. The project had institutional momentum. There were scientists at the site, instruments in the hole, data still being gathered. Drilling operations continued for a period after the Union's dissolution, the project carried forward by the force of its own long history and the commitments of the people who had devoted careers to it. But the money, which had once flowed from a state apparatus with deep political investment in the prestige of scientific achievement, began to thin. The infrastructure of Soviet science that had supported the project, the supply chains, the administrative bodies, the research institutes, was fragmenting and reorganizing. The Interdepartmental Scientific Council for the Study of the Earth's Interior and Superdeep Drilling, the body that had overseen the project since its beginning, operated in a country that no longer resembled the one that had created it. Drilling operations at Kola effectively ceased in 1992. The hole reached no greater depth after that year, and by around 1995 the project was formally closed, the research facility at Zapolyani winding down, the staff dispersing, the equipment going quiet. The site was not dismantled in any organized or ceremonial way. It was, in the manner of many things left behind by the Soviet collapse, simply abandoned. The buildings that had housed 2 decades of deep earth science fell into disrepair. The Arctic winters, which in that part of the Kola Peninsula are long and hard, the town of Zapolyani sitting well inside the Arctic Circle, the landscape flat and subarctic, the ground underlain by the same ancient Precambrian rock the drill had spent years probing, began the slow work of reclamation. Rust spread across the steel. Snow accumulated on concrete. The windows of the research buildings went dark, and at the center of all of it, somewhere in the ruins of what had been one of the most ambitious scientific projects of the Cold War, there was a hole 7.5 miles deep, barely 9 inches across, a hole that had taken 22 years to drill, that had defeated every depth record set before it, that had overturned models and produced fossils and found water and measured temperatures and lost equipment in the dark and been abandoned and sealed. The wellhead, the point at the surface where the borehole began, was capped. A metal cover was placed over the opening and welded and bolted shut. And that cover, over the years that followed, rusted. Photographs taken at the site in the years and decades after the closure show a small, heavy plate of metal, corroded and weathered, fixed to the concrete at the borehole's mouth. Not a monument. Not a marker with measurements and explanations, and a plaque describing what lies beneath. Just a rusted metal cap, bolted down, anonymous to anyone who did not already know what it covered. The deepest artificial point on Earth is sealed today by something that could be mistaken from a few meters away for an access hatch to a water pipe. There is something in that image that resists easy interpretation. One response to it is a kind of melancholy. The the sense of a great effort reduced to its smallest possible physical expression, an achievement hidden under corrosion and silence. Another response is something closer to wonder. The recognition that the most extraordinary things are not always the most visible, that 12 kilometers of penetration into the planet's crust can be represented at the surface by a circle of rusted metal barely wider than your outstretched arms. The enormity is all below, in the dark, in the rock, in the heat. The surface only ever shows the opening. Other records came in time. In 2008, a well at the Al Shaheen oil field in Qatar was drilled to a measured depth of more than 12 kilometers. In 2011, the Sakhalin I Odoptu OP11 well off the coast of Russia's Sakhalin Island reached a measured length that exceeded Kola's. These wells surpassed the Kola Superdeep Borehole in total pipe length in the sheer extent of the holes drilled. But they did something different. They were extended reach wells, angled shafts, drilling out horizontally through relatively shallow layers of rock to reach distant oil deposits. Their extraordinary measurements were of distance along the well path, not of depth below the surface. In terms of true vertical depth, the straight-down measurement, the distance from the surface to the lowest point measured as a plumb line descending into the earth, the Kola Superdeep Borehole remained and remains unequaled. No human project has ever punched a hole more directly downward into the planet. The floor is still Kola's, and yet even Kola reached only a third of the way through the continental crust at that location. The crust itself, at roughly 35 kilometers thick along the Baltic Shield, extends another 23 kilometers below the deepest point the drill touched. Below the crust lies the Mohorovičić discontinuity, the Moho, the boundary between the crust and the mantle. The mantle, which constitutes the vast majority of the Earth's volume, begins there and extends downward for thousands of kilometers. The drill never came within 100 kilometers of the Moho. The mantle, which had been spoken of in the earliest planning meetings as a distant but imaginable goal, remained as unreachable in 1992 as it had been in 1970. The project that was partly inspired by a desire to understand what lay beneath the crust never got close enough to answer that question directly. What it did instead was something perhaps more valuable, if less dramatic. It showed how much the models were wrong. Not wrong in their fundamentals. The Earth is still layered in the way geologists described, the crust still overlies the mantle, the rock still deepens and heats with descent. But wrong in their particulars. Wrong about the temperature gradient, wrong about the water, wrong about the basalt boundary, wrong about the fossils. The borehole did not confirm what scientists expected to find. It found something different. And in doing so, it made the Earth more interesting, more complicated, and more strange than it had appeared before the first drill bit was lowered into the Kola Peninsula in May of 1970. That strangeness, it turned out, was not lost on the world. The project attracted attention over its long life, scientific attention, Cold War political attention, and eventually, in the final years of its operation and the first years of its closure, a different kind of attention entirely. The kind of attention that gathers around a mystery, the kind that, in the absence of clear information, fills the gap with something more lurid and satisfying than the truth. The story surfaced in the West around 1989 and 1990, spreading through newsletters and broadcasts in a way that, before the widespread availability of the Internet, was difficult to trace and easy to amplify. The version that reached the widest audience came through a broadcast on the Trinity Broadcasting Network, an American Christian television network, and through Finnish and American religious newsletters. The story it told was this: that Soviet scientists drilling deep into the Earth, the specific hole was not always named, but the Kola Superdeep Borehole was the obvious candidate, had broken through into a vast cavern, that they had lowered a heat-resistant microphone into the cavern, that the temperature inside was approximately 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 1,100 degrees Celsius, which is comfortably in the range at which rock melts into magma, and that the microphone in the depths of that cavern had recorded sounds, human sounds, the sounds of screaming. The implication was direct. The drill had broken through the floor of the physical world and opened into the realm of the damned. The screams were the screams of those suffering there. The Soviets, according to some versions of the story, had fled the site in terror. A bat-like creature had allegedly emerged from the hole. God, or something representative of the divine, had been heard to speak. The details varied in their elaboration depending on the source, but the core claim was consistent. The deepest hole in the world had found hell. It is worth pausing for a moment on why this story spread. The Kola Superdeep Borehole was real. The depth was real. The isolation of the site on the Arctic Kola Peninsula, deep inside Soviet territory and not accessible to Western journalists, meant that what was actually happening there was only partially known outside the USSR. Into that gap of partial knowledge, the story fitted itself neatly. Of course, no one could verify it. Of course, the Soviets would deny it. Of course, there would be no footage, no direct corroboration. It was Soviet Russia inside the Arctic Circle at the height of the Cold War's final chapter. The structure of the story made it almost irrefutable to those who wanted to believe it. The audio that accompanied some versions of the claim was traced in later years to manipulated recordings. Sounds, it appears, drawn from film soundtracks, processed and layered to produce the effect of massed human voices in distress. The technical details of the story did not survive scrutiny. The temperatures claimed were impossible in the context of the actual drilling depth. The named individuals and institutions did not check out, and the accounts of what Soviet scientists had experienced at the site bore no resemblance to what those scientists, or the Soviet scientific record, actually reported. The story was, to put it simply, false. A fabrication. A piece of Cold War religious folklore circulated with conviction by people who may themselves have believed it, and spread through channels that were not equipped or inclined to verify it. It is filed correctly as a hoax, a documented, traced, debunked hoax. And yet it persists. It persists because the Kola Superdeep Borehole is, in fact, deeply strange, and the strangeness of the truth does not entirely displace the appeal of a more dramatic version. There is something in the human imagination that, when confronted with the image of a hole drilled 7 miles straight down into the earth, wants that hole to open onto something terrible and ancient and otherworldly. The rock is hot down there, the conditions are extreme. The borehole did find things that no one expected, and the hole is sealed and has been sealed for decades with a welded metal cap over which the Arctic wind passes without ceremony. The well to hell is a story that could only have grown from a real place. It needed the Kola borehole to exist, needed the verifiable strangeness of what the project found, needed the inaccessibility of the site, needed the depth that no other project had reached. The hoax is, in a strange way, a measure of how extraordinary the truth was. If the borehole had found nothing unusual, if the temperature had matched the models, if the rock layers had appeared exactly as predicted, if the cores had come back unremarkable, there would have been no story for the hoax to inhabit. The actual discoveries were strange enough to make people believe that the strangest version of events might also be true, but the actual discoveries are enough, more than enough. Consider what was genuinely found in the rock cores and the instrument logs that came back from 12,162 meters below the surface of the Kola Peninsula. Water flowing where no water should be, pulled from the crystal structure of minerals by pressure so intense that the atoms of hydrogen and oxygen bound into solid rock for millions of years were squeezed free and found nowhere to go. The fossils of 24 species of ancient plankton recovered from solid granite 6,700 meters down, preserved in organic compounds through 2 billion years of burial and heat and pressure, arriving at the surface in shattered cores that had to be pieced together like evidence from a very old crime. A seismic boundary that every model had predicted would be a transition from granite to basalt, found instead to be granite all the way through, metamorphosed, fractured, and saturated, the boundary a ghost made by altered physics rather than a change in material. And temperature. Temperature rising far faster than the models allowed, heating the rock to the point where it lost its brittleness and began, slowly, to heal the wound the drill had made, the walls creeping inward in the dark, the hole closing behind the machine that made it. The Earth did not yield any of this easily. It did not announce these findings. They came up in cores that shattered on the way to the surface, in instrument readings from sensors pushed to the edge of their tolerance, in observations made by scientists working in an Arctic research station that has since fallen into ruins. Every discovery was earned at the cost of years of effort and hundreds of kilometers of failed drill pipe and equipment abandoned in the dark 3 miles below ground. And when the money ran out, and the Soviet Union that had funded the project dissolved into something else, and the last drilling operations wound down in 1992, the hole was sealed. The findings were published and disseminated and studied, contributing to a scientific literature on the deep continental crust that continues to be referenced. The project's data on the geothermal gradient, on crustal water, on the behavior of the Conrad discontinuity, on the presence of biological material at extreme depth. All of this became part of how geophysics understands the Earth. The borehole, even closed and rusted and unreachable, continued to do work. But it did that work quietly, in journals, in graduate seminars, in the accumulated knowledge of scientists who built on what the Kola team had found. Quietly, in the way that most real science works, not in a burst of public revelation, but in a slow accumulation of corrected understanding passed between people who had spent their working lives trying to know something difficult. The hole itself sits in the Arctic silence. The facility is in ruins. The metal cap over the wellhead is weathered and corroded. The town of Zapolyarny, 10 kilometers from the Norwegian border, continues its quiet existence in the subarctic landscape. The Baltic Shield, that vast, ancient Precambrian rock that was already old when the first complex life was evolving in the warm, shallow seas of the Cambrian period, extends downward under the Kola Peninsula as it has for billions of years, mostly indifferent to what happened at its surface. And below the cap, in the dark, the hole descends. Past the zone where the basalt was predicted and not found, past the depth where the water flows from the crystals of the rock, past the level where the fossils of 2-billion-year-old plankton were entombed in granite, down through rock that grows hotter and softer with every meter, rock that was, at the deepest point the drill reached, 180 degrees Celsius, and pressing inward from every side, down to 12,262 meters, where the deepest human-made point in the history of the planet simply ends in solid stone. And then below that another 23 kilometers of crust before the moho, and then the mantle, thousands of kilometers thick, extending most of the way to the Earth's core. The drill never got a third of the way through the crust. The mantle is still down there, unreached, as it has always been. There is something restful in that. Not melancholy exactly, though there is some of that too, something closer to proportion. The planet is very old, it is very large. The crust alone at the thinnest point of the continental lithosphere is orders of magnitude thicker than the deepest wound any human project has inflicted on it. The Kola Superdeep Borehole is the most extraordinary thing of its kind ever made, and it barely scratched the surface. which is to say, it barely scratched the surface of what the surface itself conceals. What the project found in the end was not confirmation, it was complexity. The Earth, examined directly rather than through the intermediary of seismic waves, bounced off its layers from the outside, turned out to be different from its model. Not completely different, not unrecognizable, but different in ways that mattered. Different in the temperature, different in the water, different in the rock boundaries, different in what had been alive down there and how long ago. The models were the best guesses of intelligent people working with the tools available to them. The borehole replaced the guesses with measurements, and the measurements, as measurements always do, when applied to something genuinely complex, produced surprises. That is what the 22 years of drilling and the equipment abandoned in the dark and the cores arriving shattered and the hydrogen rising through the mud and the temperature climbing past every prediction were ultimately for. Not to find hell, not to breach the mantle, not to win a Cold War prestige competition, though it began partly as that, but to take the first real measurements of what the continental crust actually is, beneath the reach of anything built before. The wellhead is capped tonight. The research facility is quiet and crumbling. The Kola Peninsula in midsummer is bathed in the long Arctic light that barely fades before it returns. In winter, the darkness is nearly total, and the temperature outside drops far below what any reasonable machine should be asked to work in. The ancient Baltic Shield sits beneath all of it, as it has always sat. Patient, enormous, far older than any category of human thought that could be applied to it. And somewhere below the rusted cap, in the long dark of the shaft, the walls are still pressing inward, very slowly, the way they have been pressing since the last drill bit was pulled. The deepest point on Earth, reached by human effort over 2 decades, is gradually sealing itself, the rock reclaiming the void with the same unhurried certainty it always had. We drilled a hole 7.5 miles into the planet. We found water that had been sealed in crystals for geological ages. We found the fossilized remains of creatures that swam in ancient oceans 2 billion years before the present moment. We found that the Earth's interior runs hotter than our best models predicted, and that the rock, given enough heat and pressure, forgets how to be stone and remembers how to flow. We found that the boundaries we thought we had mapped from the outside were not where we thought they were, and were not made of what we thought they were made of. We found that the Earth is stranger than it appeared before we asked. And then the money ran out, and the Soviet Union that had sent the drill down dissolved into history, and the site fell quiet, and the cap was welded shut, and the world moved on to other questions, and the hole waited in the dark, and the rock pressed slowly inward, and the fossils of the ancient plankton remained where they had always been, undisturbed now, at 6,700 meters, encased in their granite and their organic compounds, and their 2 billion years of silence. If you feel moved to share where in the world you are listening from tonight, from a quiet room, from somewhere cold or somewhere warm, from wherever the day has finally put you down, I would genuinely like to know. The comments are there and I read them. There are more stories here of the same slow and careful kind, waiting for whenever you want them. You have done enough for one night. Put down whatever remains of the day. History will still be here in the morning. For now, rest.